So glad that all of you are here, and we are live streaming this. So if you are watching this live stream or watching it later, wonderful. Glad that we have you. You are always welcome to join us in person so that we can hear your wisdom and get your insights into the text. The text that we're looking at again today comes from Rabbi Aaron Lieb Smokler, who is preparing these texts for the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. And so I feel blessed to have her wisdom as we work through some of her writings on the Sfat Emet as we understand our Torah portion each week. So I am going to share our screen, and as I share our screen, let us say the bracha for learning Torah together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay. Can you all see the screen? Excellent. All right. So this is a very, very filled Torah.
Sorry, Rabbi, can you make it larger?
Of course. I always forget. I do 16 instead of 18.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you always ask that question because I forget. So the Torah portion, Vaera, has lots and lots of wonderful, juicy tidbits about the life of Abraham. But the main pieces of the Torah portion deal with Abraham greeting the angels and hearing that he and Sarah are going to have a son. Abraham arguing with God around Sodom and Gomorrah and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham being tested by God to take his son Isaac up the mountain for the Akedah. And that's the piece that we're going to be looking at today. This coming Shabbat, I think I'm going to study in Shul on Shabbat morning one of the other pieces of the Torah portion. So if you are either live streaming this Shabbat or in person, we'll have a chance to do a little bit more learning on the Torah portion. So we're looking at Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 and 2. Vayhi achar hadvarim ha'ela, v'Elohim nisa et Avraham vayomer elav Avraham vayomer hineni. That's the first verse, which means sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test. The divine said to him, Abraham, and he answered, Hineni, here I am. Then the next verse, Vayomer kach na et bincha et yechidcha asher ahavta et Yitzchak v'lech lecha el eretz hamoria v'ha'alehu sham le'olah al echad ha'harim asher amar elecha. And take your son, God says, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah, offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. So tell me, when you hear these two verses, when you read these verses, what comes to mind for you? What questions, what challenges, what interesting pieces of these verses call out to you? George.
A lot of things. Well, further downstream, the idea of sacrifice your child when we know that's an abomination, in Jewish law. But just looking at the first verse, Nisa, first of all, it's a verb. It's not the test. So he's going to test him. He tested him. And Hineni means I'm ready, give me the command. I'm ready to do it. Whenever you see that in the Torah. So you tell me what to do, hey, I'm going to do it. That's just line one.
Okay, so you're just noticing the test and you're noticing the word hineni.
Well, and also the idea, we're getting into you sacrifice your son that's coming on, and that's an abomination, in the Torah. So God, how can he tell us to sacrifice our son? But that's one of the reasons the Canaanites were wiped out, because they were so evil, they were doing this sort of thing. And in
Okay,
fact,
so good. So you're raising a very important
yeah,
question,
yeah.
which is how could God command something
Mhm.
that seemingly goes against the very fabric of
Yeah,
everything that Abraham believes in this God and that we,
yeah,
believe in this God to actually um, command child sacrifice? Makes
yeah.
no sense. Good. Lauren.
But then I'm thinking and I don't know, was God testing Abraham to see if he was going to stand up to him and saying, wait a second, I am not going to sacrifice my son, like testing him in that way.
Yeah.
They,
In other words,
there's no,
it would have been interesting to see Abraham say, "No, I will not do
like
that."
what kind of man and parent are you that you're willing to sacrifice your son for me? I mean, it doesn't make I don't care who you are, even if you are God. I am not sacrificing my flesh and blood for you. I mean, this is my life. I mean, I don't care who you are. I mean, I'll change religions. I'll go to. I don't know. So was he testing him?
Great, thank you, beautiful, Leora.
Yeah.
I actually looking at the two things actually, and I think it relates to what Lauren said. One is that it says Ha Elohim, and it for me it brings a question. What do you mean Ha Elohim? On the other hand, we know that the people or Avraham is really knows how to work other Elohim, other gods. So I think it could be that God is making sure he understands that it's the one God. The other thing is that I don't think that the question is Abraham is a good father or a good parent. I think Abraham is looking at Isaac as a gift. And when you receive a gift from God, you don't question God's doing. So you gave him to me as a gift to raise him upon this earth. But I guess now you're taking the gift away.
Beautiful, thank you,
Rabbi,
Judy. So it'll be Judy, George, and then Paul.
I just have a little twist on the question, which is what kind of God would ask you to do something like that? And I would not believe in that kind of God. And
Okay.
I'd rather worship an idol than believe in a God that asks you to kill your child. So,
Great. Just as a point of reference, we're not going to talk about it, but how many of you were at the class that I taught on the second day Rosh Hashanah, where we also studied this passage? So you may remember that one of the things, the key point in that class that I taught was that God speaks to Abraham twice. Once at the beginning, when God says to Abraham, "This is going to be a test," and then at the end, when God says to Abraham, "Do not touch that child." And we have a tendency to only focus on the first part of God's communication with Abraham, not the second part of God's communication with Abraham, which testifies to the fact that God does not want Abraham to sacrifice his son. And that part of the story we have a tendency to forget. And the explanation that I gave in that class, which I learned from Dr. Aaron Kohler, was that perhaps, as he learned from Maimonides, Abraham's initial experience of the divine call was not as clear as Abraham's experience to the divine call later on. And the clarity with which Abraham hears the angel calling out to God, "Do not touch your son," is enough for Abraham to put down the knife. But
Yeah.
that is not where we're going to focus on today. I just want to frame that for people because it's important to remember that there's two distinct calls that Abraham gets. One in the beginning and one at the end that clearly states that God does not want child sacrifice. Judy?
But even just putting him to the test
Ah,
for something like that to me is horrible. It's like, go kill your son, and then JK, don't do
okay,
it.
and that is the issue. Again, I agree. That's the issue that Leora raised, that George raised, and that clearly the Sfat Emet, who we're going to be looking at in a little bit, is going to try to help us understand through the lesson of Rabbi Smokler. Okay, George. Sorry, George, and then
Too quick. First, just to comment on the wording, Elohim is often the God of justice versus Adonai, which is a mercy attribute. So, but the thing I wanted to mention was Abraham is pleading to save Saddam. You know, if you can find 50, down to 10 righteous men. But here, he's not pleading, hey, save my son, trying to bargain or.
okay, well, that's not what we're looking at, George. That's not in either of these two verses. But yes, later on we do, if you read the rest of the story, it appears that Abraham does not in any way respond back to God's command and question the nature of the command.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Paul, and then Lauren.
Looking at the literal text, what stands out is there are three references to Isaac, your son, your favored son, and the son you love. And that's not insignificant. In other words, he's telling Abraham that it is a gift and that he understands the love for his son. And that raises the stakes of the test tremendously, because Isaac was promised as the progenitor of the Jewish people after Abraham.
Good. So not only is it from a personal standpoint, how could a father do this, but also from the standpoint of the covenantal promise that God made to Abraham. It seems as if that covenantal promise is now being challenged by this very command. Great, thank you.
And it says that Abraham was tested by God 10 different times, and maybe that's overdoing it, but he really needed to make sure that this was the man for whom to whom the covenant should be offered and made, and to see if his obedience to God was enough to get them through the remaining course of history.
Excellent, good. Lauren, Marilyn, and then Jill.
I was going to ask, how did we know this was God talking to Abraham? Maybe it was do we know? Was it God talking to him?
That's very good, Lauren. That's the issue that Maimonides raises on what's the nature of prophecy and how clear was Abraham in understanding the call versus. So yes, that's a great comment. How do we know when we hear a call that it is really a call from God and not elsewhere? And that's why Maimonides says later on that Abraham's vision of hearing God is much clearer at the latter part of the story than in the very beginning of the story. Great. Marilyn, and then Jill, and then
Elon.
Elon, yeah, Elon.
I have a question. In terms of historical context in that period of time, was child sacrifice very common in terms of religious?
Yes, the Canaanites were absolutely, yes.
Okay, so
the Valley of Gehinnom was probably named Gehinnom. It's because it's, like what we now determine as hell or something awful, was the valley where the children's sacrifices took place.
So this, it would stand to reason that God would put Abraham to the test to make sure that he didn't belong to the Gehinnom crowd, you know.
Yes, for Abraham, this command would not have been seen as necessarily unusual to the historical context of the time in which he was living. Jill and then Elon.
So I believe, I don't remember if it was Judy or if it was Lauren who said maybe the test was to see if he wouldn't do it. And with Paul's addition to the fact that, remembering that Isaac was going to be the leader of the Jewish people, it just seems even more so that that was the test, more than that he was supposed to actually kill his son, that he was supposed to say, wait, my son is going to be the leader of the people. I can't kill him. He has to lead the Jewish people so that you and he can have a relationship.
And there are people, Jill, who do believe that Abraham failed the test. And they use the evidence that God never speaks to Abraham again, and Abraham never speaks to Isaac, and Sarah dies, as all perhaps evidence to show that maybe what God was looking for was that kind of response. Elon.
A few little things. God is saying, take your son. And Chazal were thinking, I got two sons, Ishmael and Yitzhak. Your only son. Yes, I have both of them are only son, one to Hagar and one to Sarah, that you love. That's a problem because we know that he argued. When God said you will get Isaac, he argued and he said, why do you need? Let Ishmael be in front of you. And then God has no choice but say, Isaac, that's the one. Now we see he's saying, kach na. How do you say in English here? The word na is kind of a please. So he's saying, please take your son, which means that it's not that harsh. Now we know about the story of Hannah and Shmuel. Hannah was pleading for a son and she got. And she promised when the time will come, she will bring him up to the temple, to the place of Leah Cohen, and he will serve him. So what we here see here, that God is asking, bring him up, bringing up. The word as sacrifice is not completely clear. If it was, God knew he will not do it. Abraham is not sure. Now, as the rabbi said just a minute ago, in order to understand the beginning, we have to read the end. At the end, Abraham is told, don't do anything to him. And we think it's only at that moment, don't do anything right now. But it's not. When he said, don't do anything, it's from now on. And that's what happened. God never talked with Abraham anymore. Abraham didn't talk with Isaac anymore. They didn't walk together. The only thing he said is, took care of business, is marrying Isaac. And he allowed the angel of God to guide his slave to bring it. He was not involved. He never met Rivka, never met Esav and Yaakov. So the me'umah, the nothing, do nothing was, that's it. You are done. You succeeded. You proved your worth. You imprinted your son. And thank you very much. Go and have a good life with your girl and have 6 new children, and you are done. So it's slightly different. This is mostly, in my opinion, a test for Isaac. If Isaac will be willing to follow the God and learn to respect his God. When he thought that everything is lost, God saved him.
Great. Thank you, Elon. I just want to, all of your comments were wonderful. One that I want to just highlight was the idea that what is the definition of the word v'ha'alehu right here, when Abraham is told by God to elevate up, to raise up, to bring up. Does that literally mean to shecht, to slaughter, to kill? Or what is the nature of the sacrifice? And some read it the way that Elon read it, that he wasn't exactly God wasn't asking Abraham to actually slaughter him. Others say that that's actually not the case at all, and it was very clear. All right, let's jump in. I think I got everybody's hand. So let's jump into the text and see if we could understand specifically what the Sfat Emet helps us in his interpretation. But we're going to come back a little bit later in the class to this one additional line from Breshit when Abraham gets the command, responds to God, and then b'yom hashlishi vayisav Avram et einav vayar et hamakom merachok. On the third day, he arrives at this place that God tells him to go, and he looks up and he sees the place from afar. Rashi, in trying to understand what it means, hamakom merachok, a place from afar, says that there was a cloud on top of the mountain. That's the way that Rashi understands it, and we're going to come back to that in a little bit. So first, the Sfat Emet. Okay. So what does the Sfat Emet says? He says, in the trial of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, it is written, on the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place from afar. So this is what the Sfat Emet is focusing on. This last thing, Vayar et hamakom merachok, from afar. God tested Abraham in the virtue of awe, yirah, because Abraham was primarily characterized by love and closeness to God, in other words, chesed. As the verse says, now God had said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? And what do we know about the last, line of that? Because I am teaching Abraham to be a person of chesed. This trial was from afar. In other words, in the aspect of awe and yirah. For this reason, the verse says after the Akedah, for now I know that you fear God. Similarly, Abraham names the place Adonai Yireh, God will see or God will fear, because this is the place where he learned fear. Okay, as we've already discovered over the last couple of weeks, the Sfat Emet is not always the easiest person to read. And what we need to do is try to unlock, unpack, slowly try to understand what it is that he is saying here, because there's a lot of potential wisdom if we understand his message. Leora.
I just have a question regarding the text. If you can scroll up, I guess, right there is Vayisai et einav, Vayar, I can't see the dots, whatever they are.
Vayar.
They are, Vayar. And for me, the thing that jumped up is fear.
Yeah.
Because Yirah is also fear.
Okay, so let me explain.
Okay.
So what Leora is saying, which is really great if we know Hebrew, but if we don't know Hebrew, we miss it. The Hebrew word to see, roeh, sounds similar and has similar letters to the word yirah, which is to fear. And that's exactly what the Sfat Emet is doing. He's playing with this word here, the one that I've highlighted, Vayar, to say maybe it's not so much about Abraham seeing the place, but Abraham fearing the his relationship to God. So I guess what I want to first do to try to understand the Sfat Emet is ask you, what's the difference between having a relationship to God based on fear versus based on love?
Oh. It's loaded, Rabbi.
Why?
Why is it loaded? Because I see many people that are religious people, Shomari Shabbat and mitzvot. I don't see the love in their practice. I see the fear in their practice. Their fear of this old man sitting on a chair will strike them down. And I don't know that I see many people loving God in my surrounding, in my experience in life.
So what I'm hearing, Leora, you saying is that people oftentimes respond to their relationship to God out of fear of the consequences if we don't do what it is that God commands us to do. And that the motivation for a relationship to God, or the motivation for observing the mitzvot, is one of punishment, consequences, things like that. Great. Marilyn.
I think when you love God, when you approach God feeling love, you're open, and it's more expansive. When you approach God in fear, it closes you off, and you just have a very narrow view of things. You have more options when you approach it with love.
Good, nice. How do you all approach your relationship to God? Do you see it based upon Ahava or based upon Yirah?
If I take Yirah as awe, not as fear, fear and trembling. In other words, it's so beyond our understanding that it makes you shiver and just be mystified by the wonder. That's fear to me.
Okay, great. Thank you, Paul. A very, very important comment that Paul just said. It's not about fear in this context may not be about the consequences of our actions, but rather the overwhelming mystery of God in our life. And what perhaps the Sfat Emet is having us think about is, for a command like this to be given by God, it tends to cause us to question, can we ever really understand or know God's ways? Because from everything that you all said earlier, from a practical, logical, rational standpoint, it makes absolutely no sense for God to offer this test to Abraham. And so what the Sfat Emet is inviting us to think about is, why should we think that we could grasp the full knowledge of God and God's ways? There is something Paul's saying that is so much bigger than just logic when it comes to God. And having a relationship with God in that regard is having a relationship out of yirah as opposed to out of love or chesed, which seems based upon far more practical, rational, logical ways of seeing and understanding God in our life. Jill, you have your hand up.
Yeah, excuse my out of breathness. I'm exercising.
I'm exhausted watching you exercise. I wish I could be doing the same thing.
Well, I know you would be on your bike if you could be, Rabbi. So anyway, what I was thinking, you asked how I see God in my life. And for me, God is kind of in everything and in everybody. And so my awe comes more from when I see, when it was with humility, basically, I think. And when I see another who is really in their tove, and I'm just in complete awe of that and wanting to, be the same way, and seeing my own Ra as the sort of the fear part, the sin part, and then, seeing the love that I can give and the love in another that I can have a relationship with, and that I can bring the light into the world. To me, that's kind of my two sides of God.
Nice, very nice. Thank you. That resonates, I hope, hopefully with others as well. Anybody else want to offer an understanding of Yirah and Ahava as relating to God? Okay, so let's go on a little bit further in the text. Here's Rabbi Smokler's understanding of this Sfat Emet. The Sfat Emet suggests that the distance between Abraham and God through this trial was born of the gap between Abraham's inclinations towards love and God's uncomfortable push toward submissive fear. What does she mean there? Why does she say God's uncomfortable push towards submissive fear? How do you understand that in relationship to the way Sfat Emet understands Abraham in this story? What does Abraham do in the story? What doesn't Abraham do in the story? Somebody said it earlier.
Question.
He doesn't stand up and say,
Exactly.
There's no way I'm sacrificing my son. This is my flesh, my blood. I love this child. Go away, God.
Exactly. So Abraham's reaction is so apparently so contrasted to his reaction in the Sodom and Gomorrah story, where he does argue and he does protest and he does challenge God. And so for the Sfat Emet, the way in which Rabbi Smokler's understanding this is God is challenging Abraham, right, to respond in a very different way. The command is so overwhelming that Abraham's response is one of submissive fear, which is not a comfortable place for Abraham, not a familiar place, I should say, for Abraham and Abraham's relationship to God, which is her very next point. The God of Yirah was relatively unknown to Abraham until this point. I'm not sure what that's doing there. He would have to learn to come close to this foreign force, one who makes wild, irrational, and painful demands. I want us to pay attention to this last sentence of Rabbi Smokler's, because I think it's really an important one in terms of thinking about our own relationship to God. What is it that she's inviting here? What is she asking us to think about when it comes to our relationship with God? Right? When is it easy for us to believe in God? When is it easy for us to experience a sense of the divine in our life? When do you most often feel that?
When things are good.
Yes. Give us some specific examples. When do you feel overwhelmed by the presence of godliness in your life?
Oh, with the birth of a child is probably the biggest.
Yeah. There is this unbelievable sense of godliness in the birth of a child. When else?
When you're in love.
When you're in love. Very nice. When else?
You're lighting the Shabbat candles and it's Shabbat.
Beautiful, right? A holy religious moment such as that. Maybe a remarkable moment out in nature where you experience the divine. And
when your kid leaves your home.
If indeed that ever happens, yes. When is it more difficult to experience the divine?
When it's beyond rational understanding.
Good. And give me, what are some examples of that?
Good people suffering, children dying of cancer, natural disasters that wipe out entire peoples, viruses and sickness.
Hunger.
That's right.
Holocaust, of course.
What's that, Jill?
The Holocaust, of course.
Okay, so all of these moments that it seems to us where God is absent in these very difficult, tragic, heavily laden, sad, oppressive moments of life, those are the moments when it feels as if God is distant. And I think what Rabbi Smokler is saying is when God says to Abraham, take your son, your only son, the son you love, and bring him up to the mountain and offer him as an olah, that's a moment where we do not feel that warm, loving, embracing God as you just were describing first, but rather it's that moment of great misunderstanding, of mystery, of where is God's voice? Where is God's presence in such a moment? And the test, according to the Sfat Emet, is can Abraham experience God and be close to God in moments such as the latter ones that we were just describing than the former ones? And if Abraham is a model for all of us, I guess the question really is, can we find and experience a relationship and a connection to God in those moments that are everything counter to where we might find and experience and feel God's presence? Right? That's what the Sfat Emet, according to Rabbi Smokler, is inviting us to think about. It's so much harder for us, right? To be, yeah, Ilan.
The thing is, submissive fear, I would say I didn't feel it yet, or maybe I did. That few times I was sick and I felt, that's it, I'm gone, I'm going to go. Then you have a submissive fear and you ask, hey, help me. But the key here is that every person, and especially in Israel, when the kids are getting to be 18 years old, they join the army. And the parents are saying, go and serve. And you might die, and you will make your best, and hopefully God will help you. In a submissive fear, we send the kids. We don't tell them, hide under a rock, run away to a different country. Don't help us. We ask them, please come and help us. And the kids are coming up and say, I'm willing, hineni, I'm ready. So we have to see it in this light that there is absolutely fear in both sides. Abraham and Isaac, when he understood what's going on to happen, but he was willing. Abraham was willing and he was willing. Now to say that you should never allow your son to be sacrificed, like serve in the army, serve in World War II and save the Jews, part of them, it's not right. Life is more important than the total life of the Jewish community is more important than the individual to some degree. So there is submissive fear, and we hope he will be good.
Wow, what a powerful comparison to a parent in Israel sending a child off to serve in Tzahal, in the military. That's really a beautiful way of framing for us this notion of the Akedah. What does it mean to potentially sacrifice a child? What does it mean to let go of the one you fully and completely love so wholeheartedly, to send them out into a world that is filled with great danger? And how do you hold on to a belief that God is going to be there to hopefully protect your child, even in the call that says, give me your child? Really very nice. George and then Jill.
Yeah, first of all, you don't send your child to the army. The person is drafted. In other words, the government calls them. It's not, they don't say to the parent, will you please send your.
I guess, George, what Ilan is speaking about is not the practical, which you're responding to, but the emotional and spiritual response.
But you're not killing your son. I mean, the odds are the person's going to come back. But that's not what I wanted to talk about.
Well, again, I'm not a parent sending my child into the military, so I don't know if I would be as cool and collected as you are in that response.
Well,
And
I'm very
just
cool
look at
about
it from statistics.
being in it. My brother was in it. My dad was in it. All volunteered, you know. But that's all beside the point. You know, we're called upon to be a hafta, you know, to love God.
So,
You know, the awe of heaven. But if you need this awe, why is this coming so late? You know, because he's done all these things. You know, why would you have to tell him now at 100 or whatever that, hey, you know, you should be awe-inspired by, you know, by all this stuff. You know, as a learning to gain wisdom.
Yeah, that's a very fair question. Very fair question.
Yeah.
Paul, you're muted.
Could you go back to the text for a moment?
Of course. Yeah.
What I find pretty interesting about her is this idea of God's uncomfortable push towards submissive fear. I read it as though when God created Adam and Eve and they were good, and the generations after completely disappointed him with their misbehavior and destructiveness. And so in order for God, after Noah, in order for the generations to be good, he had to push them toward a fear of him rather than just chesed and love. It didn't work. And so, and this submissive fear is like, you know, again, he's destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. I would hope that inspired awe of his power, that showed that submission is not necessarily a bad thing.
So are you saying that the idea of not sparing the rod to your child is actually sometimes the better approach to making that child respond in the way that you want that child to respond?
I don't know if I'd literally say the rod, but yes, there are punishments and there are consequences that teach children a lesson. You know, I was potched when I was a kid, and I think it helped me understand that some things are beyond the pale.
Okay, let's go a little bit deeper. Let's
Rabbi,
yeah.
I had wanted to say something.
Sure, of course.
George talked about sending, and Elon talked about sending their children off to the army. And I can't say that I would be able to do that. I haven't lived in Israel, so I didn't get brought up with that notion. I was young enough to know about the draft, but I was really happy when it wasn't going to affect my children. And I don't know if I'm a good enough person or whatever to feel that way.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair comment.
Sorry, Rabbi. I don't understand you, Jill. You rather send my child over to the draft than your child? Are you choosing like the Holocaust?
No, I'm not saying that
It sounds like.
I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that I don't think I have the ability to do that. And I would feel really bad for your child if you did it. And I don't know the answer to the problem, but I find it a problem. And I don't know if God's asking me to do that or not. It's Israel asking you to do it. As a citizen of Israel, I don't know.
I think partially, Jill, it's part of the culture in which somebody lives, right? If you lived in Israel and you saw that this is what it means to be a citizen of the state, while I imagine there is enormous amount of fear and trepidation, as Elon articulated, there might also be, as clearly it shows in the numbers of people that do have their children be drafted, that there's a tendency to overcome the fear for the sake of the commitment of being a citizen and the loyalty to the government and the desire to defend and protect the country for all its citizens. But that's harder to feel when we don't live within the culture that happens.
But I do have the culture of, for instance, during the pandemic, my kids could have gone and volunteered to do DoorDash or something like that. And I was really happy that they didn't. Now my daughter is in medical school, so obviously she did do it. And I lived with the consequences. It was her consequences and her decision. But I was really happy my kids weren't putting themselves out on the front line. And so maybe I'm a lesser person and I can take that. But I think it's really hard to just trust, even though I know that's one of my midot, to trust that it's going to be okay.
Well, because the point is, it may not be okay. That's the risk of living. We can have a lot of emunah, but at the end of the day, there still may be, as I think what the Sfat Emet is saying, is irrational, painful, challenging demands that turn out not to be the way it turned out in the case of the Akedah. There may be death, there may be loss, there may be sacrifice, there may be all of those things. But to be in relationship with God means to, engage in the experience of a God who asks of us things that are beyond our rational ability to understand why. Lauren and then Elon.
I mean, all through your child's life, you're faced with things that you have to allow them to do, from the time they're, like as a newborn, they're a part of you. Then all of a sudden you send them to preschool and you hope they're safe in preschool. Then you hear these, stories about, trees falling on kids or, God forbid, mass shootings at school. And then all of a sudden your child's a teenager and they start to drive and you have to allow them to drive by themselves. And then they're at parties and they could be getting drunk. And then they go off to college. And both my kids went to school where they had to fly to college. And I used to say, you tell that pilot to, be safe. And if there was a thunderstorm and they had to fly home during thunderstorms. And then they both went abroad for their junior year. And Michael went right after 9/11. Do you think I wanted him to go to England after 9/11? I couldn't even take him to the airport, but I had to let him go. And then they both went to Israel and I had to let them go. And it's like, you're always faced with these challenges as a parent that you have to put your faith in. I guess I was putting my faith in God, that everything was going to turn out okay. And it somehow did. If I had my choice, we all would have been living, well, one is still living here, but no one would have ever left. But it's very challenging. You just have to do it. You just have to do it. You didn't want to do it, but you had to do it. Otherwise, no one would have ever done it.
Thank you, Lauren. Yeah, Elon.
There is very important point about this episode. In the Jewish, it went down a little and Passover took the most important event in our history. But for Islam, there is a story about Ishmael who was sent to the desert and he was going to die under a bush and God gave him a well and saved him. And that create their tradition of sacrifice and God testing and God protecting their father. In Christianity is even more, because Jesus was put on the cross and he died, but then he was resurrected. So we can see that this story created three major religions. And it's very, very important. And the Christians are not saying he should not have been put, why God allowed him to die. They don't ask those questions. They said God tested him and he passed the test. They are happy in his success. So I don't know exactly what I'm saying related to here, but this event that we are just going through is the most important for Christian and for the Islam. That's the biggest holiday. And for us, Passover took over.
Well, I don't know if this, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I would push and say that this story actually does have a great deal of resonance in our tradition, even if there's not a specific holiday associated with it. But let's keep going. Let's take a look a little bit more of the Sfat Emet and Rabbi Smokler's so we can conclude. So he says at the end of the story, God, now I know that you fear God. We ask, was not Abraham's service out of love, which is higher than serving from fear? Why does the verse attribute to Abraham only fear of God? In truth, it was not God's will that Isaac be sacrificed, and Abraham's heart, therefore, felt no attachment or love for this act, because it was not God's true will. That is why it was a trial. And this is why the verse says he saw the place, Hamakom, from afar. And Rashi's comment back here was Abraham saw a cloud on top of the mountain. In other words, perhaps what this implies is that there was a lack of clarity. That's the symbolism of the cloud, a lack of clarity in the way in which Abraham heard or understood the command, which I think relates to the fact that there are often many moments in life where we also engage in that lack of clarity. We ask the question, what does God want us to learn from this moment? Why did this event transpire? Because this was not a moment of chesed, and yet I have to live through this moment and try to grapple with what message there is for me and how I can still maintain a relationship with God, even in the face of what I feel is God's absence, God's distance. And we have those moments, unfortunately, in our life. And those moments, I think, are every bit as important to determining the nature of who we are in this world than the moments that are very easy in life. The ones that come readily to us as feeling the expansiveness of God's presence. And so let's conclude with how Rabbi Smokler understands this. In other words, the distance between Abraham and God was born of the gap between God's desires and God's words. God did not want Isaac as a sacrifice. God wanted Abraham's will to be sacrificed. Could he submit to God's command, knowing that a loving God would never issue a command? Would he revere God even when he couldn't love God? In other words, would he submit to the will of God? Would he act, would he behave in a manner in which God is asking him, even though that pushes away any possibility of loving God in this moment? Because the act is so great against what Abraham would ultimately want and desire. Perhaps Yirah means trusting a God whose ways are perplexing and even self-contradicting. It means yielding to Hamakom, the place, even when it feels so very far away. In this rich imagery of clouds, she says she sees something else. It seems to me that what Abraham understood upon seeing the cloud was the essential cloudiness of his relationship with God. He saw the charge of the Akedah with all its horror and confusion was precisely about reckoning with unclarity, with paradox, with absurdity, with a God who contradicts and undermines God's self, with promises that seem broken, covenants that seem shattered. Abraham came to understand at this moment that to approach God, to have an ongoing and live spiritual life, would require a difficult and maybe continuous encounter with cloudiness. right? I think going back to Elon's example, because I think it's a great example of the idea of being a citizen of the state of Israel and sending your child off to the military, right? That is a moment of having to live with unclarity, with paradox, with absurdity, or the way that Lauren described it earlier, right? Those moments in which we cannot see with clarity the end game of the decisions that we're making, and yet still hold to have faith in God and in God's goodness in this world, even when it doesn't seem like God's goodness and the good in this world exists. Right? That's the way the Sfat Emet and Rabbi Smokler understand the lesson of the Akedah. In a world of topsy-turvy life that we live, in a COVID and post-COVID world where nothing seems to work the way that we want it to work, where our democracy is being challenged every day, where we wish the world would function in a different way, can we still have faith and belief in God and godliness? That's the question that this Torah portion invites us to consider. Ellen, we're going to end, but did you have a last comment to wrap up?
No, I didn't, but I love what you just read, because that is the only way I can exist in this world, is not really knowing and not really seeing God, but just feeling God. And at times in my life, God is behind a cloud, and that's where I think, and yet God is very near. It's both.
And I think if it was any clearer, then it wouldn't be God, right? If everything was so clear and certain, then what would we need the mystery of God for?
Well, in some ways, I've heard you say, I've read, God is where we got God in, and we also, so that's the closeness, but then it's also the awe, is the distance. The Adon Olam is one of my favorite prayers for just that reason.
Yes, because it's both immanent and transcendent all at the same time.
Yeah. So I appreciate your just having read that, and thanks for the talk today.
All right, everybody, have a good one.
And bye.
Rabbi, where can we see that last passage? Can you email it to us?
Yeah, just send me an email to remind me, and I will send you the whole thing.
Yishar koach, Rabbi.